Late last year, the parties met in a crucial meeting to start negotiations for a post-Kyoto treaty, and they tried to negotiate what was called the Bali Roadmap. Now, I can't emphasise enough what a watershed this particular negotiation was, a huge turning point. And I have a series here of never before. Never before has the science been so unequivocal. Never before has the window of opportunity for effective action been so narrow. Never before have developing country commitments actually been on the table, not in the form of targets, but other types of commitments. Never have the stakes been so high. Never have the negotiations been so gruelling. They went round the clock on the last day, right through till the early afternoon of the very next day, and the negotiators were completely ragged. Never before has the US been so isolated and censured as it was at Bali. And never before have the issues been so complex and the negotiations so fraught. Now, I'll only have to skip through the actual Bali Compromise. Effectively, what was agreed was that the parties would agree to negotiations towards a long-term target. There was a huge push to extract a commitment from developing countries towards that IPCC target. But due to the strenuous opposition of the US, it was taken out, but it was kind of snuck back in a footnote. So developed countries agreed that they would work towards quantified emission reductions, but without putting a number on it. Developing countries agreed they would take appropriate actions, verifiable and reportable ones, but not in the form of a target. Most of the negotiations were over a paragraph 1, B1 and B2, so the Australians called them the banana clauses. So the developing country commitment was B2 and the developed country commitment was B1. The bifurcated architecture of Kyoto was retained, where you have this Annex 1, non-Annex 1 division, where the Annex 1 countries take on much more heavy lifting under the general idea of that the North or the rich countries should lead and show the way because they can and because they're mostly responsible for past emissions. There was a new focus on emission reductions from deforestation, which wasn't included in Kyoto, so that's a big breakthrough and a big opportunity for developing countries to reduce emissions. Adaptation moved to centre stage, and if we're going to look after developing countries, then assisting with adaptation is going to be absolutely crucial. There was a lot of talk about technology transfer and financing, so those issues are firmly on the table, but we await really serious commitments in terms of fulfilling those obligations. There were some very significant geopolitical alignments. Australia left America out in the cold. There was a little earthquake at Bali, actually. Everyone talked about this seismic shift in international politics. It happened in the first week of the negotiations. It was symbolic. China started to play a much more proactive role in leading the G77. A lot of people, I think, underestimate the efforts China is making. China fully understands how its people is going to be impacted by climate change. It's just that it has a Herculean task on its hands. The US, God bless its soul, moved from denial into acknowledgement that Houston, we do have a problem, but not to the point of committing to the sorts of targets that the IPCC are talking about. Intense pressure, or intense interest, I beg your pardon, on who will be the next US president, because China and America are the two big global aggregate emitters. It's been argued that China's just overtaken America in aggregate emissions, but the average Chinese has about 1/4 the size of the carbon footprint of the average American. So as Al Gore said in his speech at Bali, we must look beyond Bush. There's an enormous workload facing the negotiators who are trying to reach an agreement in Copenhagen by the end of next year, 2009. If successful, we will have a new protocol called the Copenhagen Protocol. If not, then the negotiations will labour on. We're looking to find ways of deepening developed country commitments, integrating the US somehow, and engaging China and India, who are the two major emerging emitters from the developing world, because we know that the future growth in emissions is going to come from these regions in the world. We're looking to find new commitments from developing countries, but not necessarily in the form of mandatory emission reduction targets. There's all sorts of schemes, I can perhaps talk about that later, possibly voluntary targets with all sorts of rewards for achieving them, but no penalties for not achieving them. Bigger focus on adaptation, deforestation, all sorts of transfer, technology and resource transfers to assist in environmental capacity building in the south. And of course, refining the market mechanisms that have been developed under the Kyoto Protocol. But what we have is a kind of Mexican standoff. This is from Reservoir Dogs. That's Harvey Keitel. It's the developing world on its ground, on the ground there. It's a sense in which the US is saying, we're not doing anything until you do something. So they're both going to pretty much harm their own nations by continuing to pollute. But one has a bigger moral case for having more slack cut for it, and that's the developing world, in this case China. So what can we expect of the future US president? Well, we don't know who that's going to be, so mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the greenest of them all? Well, Barack has got a bolder long-term target, but at the end of the day, his interim target is really not that different from John's. I'm sorry I'm moving quickly here, but I'm probably running out of time. John's plan is pretty much, again, to stabilise America's emissions by 2020, so we're not looking to any cuts here. A big bear hug to nuclear power, and modest increases in fuel efficiency, not quite as stringent as those that Barack is seeking. So I guess the bottom line from both presidential candidates is that none of them can promise more than a stabilisation of US emissions by 2020. And you'll notice no one has mentioned the K word in the presidential campaign. The Clinton-Gore administration negotiated an emission target of minus 7%. I think I mentioned minus 7 for the EU, that was actually minus 8. There's no way even an Al Gore as president could bring America to that sort of cut by 2012. It's beyond the reach of the US at the moment. So I can't see America ever ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. I can see America becoming part of a new Copenhagen Protocol if it's sufficiently flexible for it, even for the greenest president, simply because it's too big, too Herculean a task. I'm not trying to apologise for America. I'm just pointing out how much important time was lost under the current US administration. I'm focusing on the two major aggregate emitters here because I think that's really the crunch of the problem. China, of course, has huge divisions amongst its environment, science-informed agencies and its development agencies. It has undertaken significant efforts, spectacular investment in renewables, wind power, but it's also continuing to build a coal-fired station a week. And so we have a real problem there, and our biggest challenge is to find a way for China, India, and the rest of the developing world to leapfrog over our mistakes while still fulfilling their legitimate aspirations for a much better life. So I think everything will depend on the targets that the parties agree to by Copenhagen 2009 and the underlying energy and development path that the world chooses over the next 10 years. So I think the negotiations in Poland later this year and in Copenhagen next year are absolutely crucial, a complete watershed in the negotiations that have more than a 15-year history. What we need is an architecture, as I said, that will cut slack for developing countries, assist them in capacity building so that their development path can be greener. But I think the revolution has to happen in the affluent society. We're the ones who have to take the cuts. We're the ones who have to show leadership and make it very easy for the developing world to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robyn Eckersley, and thank you also for